So today we are finishing up talking about the endocrine system, starting off with the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. So we talked a great deal so far about the anterior pituitary, so we're going to kind of discuss the posterior pituitary here. And this does not synthesize any hormones, but it is responsible for storing, but it does store and release these various hormones from axon terminals that are going to have two hormones produced by the neurosecretory cells that are found in the hypothalamus. All right, these two hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. This is also called vasopressin. So axons from that neurosecretory cells are going to form the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, and the axon terminals that are in the posterior pituitary are going to be associated with specialized neuroglia that are called pituocytes. And these cells are going to have supporting roles that are going to be similar to what you would see in an astrocyte. So looking at the blood supply for the posterior pituitary, this is going to be supplied by the inferior hypophyseal arteries, and these are going to branch from the internal carotid artery. So that's coming off to supply blood to that posterior pituitary. So in the posterior pituitary itself, the inferior hypophyseal arteries are going to drain into the capillary plexuses of the infundibular process. And this is going to be basically just a capillary network that's responsible for receiving secreted oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So from that plexus then, hormones are going to pass into the posterior hypophyseal vein, and then they're going to be from there distributed to the various target cells that are in the other tissue, like the uterus, mammary glands, kidneys, arterioles, depending on what kind of hormone we're discussing. So there is going to be obviously a great deal of control that's involved with secretions from the posterior pituitary. All right, so for starters, neurosecretory cells that are found in the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus are going to synthesize oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And these hormones are then going to be packaged into cute little vesicles so that they can be transported to wherever they need to go. Those vesicles are then going to move via fast axonal transport along the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, like what you can see here. And they're going to move to the axon terminals that are found in the posterior pituitary, where they're then going to be stored. Right? And then when the appropriate stimulus occurs, this is going to excite the hypothalamus. And then a nerve impulse is going to trigger the exocytosis and therefore the release of either oxytocin or ADH into the bloodstream. And that release of those two hormones is then going to, those released hormones are then going to travel to the target tissue throughout the body. Whether, again, that be the uterus, the mammary glands, kidneys, arterioles, etc. So that's how we're going to have some sort of control or going to deal with the secretions that are going to need to take place from the posterior pituitary gland. So looking at the two hormones that are involved with the posterior, secreted from the posterior pituitary, we have oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So starting with oxytocin, this is going to be released in response to any kind of stretch that's placed on the cervix during childbirth. All right, and so this can do a number of things. This is going to, in the mother's uterus, this is going to enhance contractions, and in breast tissues, it's going to stimulate milk ejection, and this by those mammary glands, and this is going to be done in response to suckling. So the functions of oxytocins in males or in non-pregnant females is a little bit less clear. However, there have been experiments done in animals that suggest that it's going to have an important action within the brain that's going to be involved with fostering parental caretaking kind of behaviors towards young offspring. So like that kind of nurturing sort of feeling. And it may also be in part responsible to feelings of sexual pleasure during intercourse or during after intercourse. Is associated with some attachment potentially after, like emotional attachment after having intercourse potentially. So very interesting. The second hormone that's coming from the posterior pituitary is the antidiuretic hormone. And the amount of this hormone that's being secreted is going to vary based on the blood's osmotic pressure. So ADH is going to decrease urine output, and this is going to be part of a negative feedback loop where the osmoreceptors that are found in the hypothalamus are going to monitor the blood osmotic pressure. So an increase in blood volume is going to cause a decrease in antidiuretic secretions, and then on the opposite side, a decrease in blood volume is going to cause an increase in antidiuretic hormone secretions. So sort of an inverse relationship there. So here for your studying delights, we have a cute little table summarizing the role of the posterior pituitary hormones. Next up in our discussion of the endocrine system, we have the thyroid gland. This is a kind of butterfly-shaped, or bow tie maybe, shaped gland. It's going to be located inferior to the larynx and anterior to the trachea. And this is going to have a right and a left lateral lobe, which you can see here. And this is going to be connected by an isthmus. So some glands are also going to have a kind of a pyramidal lobe that sort of projects off of the isthmus, but that's not always evident. That can vary in size significantly. And you can kind of see that there. So the thyroid gland, the microscopic spherical sacs that we see in the thyroid gland are called thyroid follicles, and we will look at this stuff in the lab under the microscopes as well. So these thyroid follicles are going to make up most of the thyroid gland. And the wall of each of these little follicles is going to consist of primarily of cells that are called follicular cells, most of which that are going to extend to the lumen of that follicle. So you can see those follicular cells coming around there. So then a basement membrane is going to surround each of these follicles, and the follicular cells are going to be stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, and they are going to produce T3 and T4, those thyroid hormones, called tetraiodothyronine, and triiodothyronine. We talked about those structures in our previous lecture. There are then these parafollicular cells, which you can see off to the side here, and these are going to be responsible for producing the hormone calcitonin, and this is going to help to regulate calcium homeostasis. And we'll talk more about that later, perhaps, possibly. So, the thyroid hormones are going to be very important within the body. They are going to be involved in several different things. For starters, they're going to be involved in the increase of the basal metabolic rate. They're also going to help to maintain normal body temperature, as well as stimulate protein synthesis and increase the use of glucose and fatty acid for ATP production. They're also going to regulate beta receptors, those catecholamine receptors, and they're also going to work in conjunction with the human growth hormone and insulin in order to accelerate the body's growth. So, as far as synthesis and release of these hormones, the thyrotropin releasing hormones, the TRHs, are going to come from the hypothalamus, and the thyroid stimulating hormones are going to come from the anterior pituitary, and these are both going to stimulate the synthesis and the release of the thyroid hormone in this 5-step process. So here we can see this is another negative kind of feedback here. So when we have low levels of our thyroid hormone, low levels of T3 or T4, or potentially we have some sort of metabolic rate that stimulates a low metabolic rate. This is going to trigger the hypothalamus and to release our thyroid releasing hormone, or our thyrotropin releasing hormone, And this is going to be carried by the portal veins to the anterior pituitary, and this is going to stimulate the release of the thyroid stimulating hormone. From there, then, the thyroid stimulating hormone is going to be released into the blood, and this is going to stimulate those thyroid follicular cells. This is going to result in an increase in the production or the release of T3 and T4 into the blood by those follicular cells. This is then going to restore levels of T3 and T4, and this is going to activate our negative feedback loop and negate this initial alteration to our controlled condition and cause so basically a removal of that stimuli. So we no longer have low T3, T4 levels, so we would not need to stimulate the release of our thyrotropin releasing hormone. So our negative feedback loop there. And here you can see that same that same process just described right here. So here in this handy-dandy table for your studying delights, we have the summary of the various thyroid gland hormones. And then moving forward to discuss the parathyroid gland. This is going to be located on the posterior aspect of each of the lobes of the thyroid gland. You can kind of see them here in the back there, little green dots kind of looking thing. There are going to be 2 parathyroid glands on the back of each of the lobes of the on the back of each of the lobes of that thyroid gland. Those are our parathyroid glands right there. So there are 4 of them total. There they are. So the parathyroid gland is going to contain 2 main types of cells. We've got our chief cells, or our principal cells, and these are the cells that are responsible for producing parathyroid hormone. And then this parathyroid hormone is what's going to be responsible for regulating the homeostasis of calcium and phosphate. And it does this by increasing blood calcium levels and decreasing blood phosphate levels. So oxyphil cells, whose function is not known in normal parathyroid glands, are also going to be present, but they are going to secrete excessive amounts of parathyroid hormone in cases of parathyroid cancer. We don't really know what they do under normal conditions, like I said, but if you have parathyroid cancer, you're going to have these cells producing outrageous amounts of parathyroid hormone. So this parathyroid hormone, excuse me, that's going to be produced by the parathyroid gland, this is going to be the major regulator of levels of calcium and magnesium and phosphate ions in the blood. And those are 3 very important ions that are going to play a major role in the body. So the specific action of parathyroid hormone is going to be to increase the number and the activity of osteoclasts that are associated with the bone. So the result is going to be elevated bone reabsorption, which is going to release ionic calcium and phosphate into the blood. All right. Parathyroid hormone is also going to act in the kidneys, and it does this by slowing the rate at which we lose calcium and magnesium from the blood into the urine. So it's slowing the filtration of calcium and magnesium out of the blood. All right. It's also going to increase the loss of phosphate, of this. It's going to increase the loss of that phosphate from the blood into the urine as well. And this is because more phosphate is going to be lost in the urine than is gained from the bone. So parathyroid hormone is going to decrease blood phosphate levels, and it's going to increase blood calcium and magnesium levels. Overall, this is going to promote the formation of the hormone calcitrol, which is going to be the active form of vitamin D. All right, so calcitrol is going to increase the rate of calcium, phosphate, and magnesium reabsorption that's taking place in the GI tract in the blood, into the blood. So it's making sure that you're sucking in and absorbing as much of the calcium, phosphate, and magnesium that you just ingested. It's making sure you suck in as much of that as you can so that it can be absorbed through like the intestines, the gastrointestinal tract, and make it into the blood. So those are 2 very important roles there. That brings us then to something called calcitonin. And this is going to be produced by the thyroid gland, and it's going to work in conjunction. So it's going to work together with parathyroid hormone and calcitrol. And it's going to work together to regulate calcium homeostasis in the body. And calcium is a very important molecule in the body. So we need to make sure that we have this regulated in all kinds of ways. So, for starters, it's going to be when we have a higher than normal level of calcium that's in the blood. This is going to stimulate those parathyroid cells in the thyroid, the parafollicular cells, in the thyroid gland to release more calcitonin. All right. The calcitonin is then going to inhibit the activity of those osteoclasts, and this is therefore going to decrease the blood calcium levels. So that's how that first bit works. If for some reason there is a lower than normal level of calcium in the blood, this is going to stimulate the chief cells of the parathyroid gland to produce more parathyroid hormone. This parathyroid hormone is therefore going to promote the reabsorption of bone extracellular matrix, which is going to result in the release of calcium into the blood. And it's also going to result in a slowing of the loss of calcium into the urine. So the body's hanging on to that extra calcium. It's not being filtered out by the kidneys. This, in theory, should, ideally, raise the blood levels of calcium. The parathyroid hormone is also going to stimulate the kidneys to synthesize calcitrol. This is our active form of vitamin D, and that calcitrol is going to then stimulate increased absorption of calcium from the foods that we take in the gastrointestinal tract. All right, this is also going to help increase the blood levels of calcium that we have in the body. Right? So these two things are working together to regulate and maintain an appropriate level of calcium in the body. So we're maintaining and regulating calcium homeostasis. So again, here we have a cute little table looking at the parathyroid gland hormones and what they do, etc. The next part of the endocrine system that we are going to discuss is the adrenal glands. These are also called the suprarenal glands, and these are going to be located on top of each kidney, and they are called the suprarenal because supra meaning on top of, so they are sitting on top of those kidneys. We can see them right here. Aren't they cute? Little adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands are going to be divided into two distinct regions, and they are going to be distinct structurally and functionally. So they're going to look different when we look at them under the microscope, and they're also going to have different functional roles. So a large peripherally located adrenal cortex is going to be the outermost layer here, and this is going to make up about 80 or 90% of the gland. This is the vast majority of the gland is going to be adrenal cortex. All right, and then in the middle, we have this small, cute little adrenal medulla. All right, so in between those two, in the middle there. All right, and then this gland is going to be covered by a connective tissue capsule. So you can see all three of those animated, nice and cute, right there. So those are the two main layers of the adrenal glands. We're going to talk about what they do in just a sec. Coming up. So the various layers, of course, we divide these two layers into more layers. So the cortex of the adrenal cortex is going to be divided histologically into three different regions. And you do need to know these regions, and you need to know functionally the difference between these three regions. All right, so you need to be able to identify them. You need to know what they're producing. All right, it's important. So for starters, the first zone that we have is the zona glomerulosa. All right, this is this outermost layer here, and this is going to secrete hormones that are called mineralocorticoids, and these are used to regulate mineral homeostasis. All right, our next layer down here is going to be the zona fasciculata. This is going to secrete hormones called glucocorticoids, and these are going to impact glucose homeostasis. And then last but not least, we have the zona reticularis, and this is going to secrete weak androgens. These are going to be hormones that are going to have a degree of masculinizing effect. Everybody needs them, they're important, but they're going to be more prevalent in men. So, looking at each of these, the hormones produced by each of these different layers. Starting with our mineralocorticoids, this is a great example of mineralocorticoids is aldosterone. And this is going to be a hormone that's involved. It's going to be used to increase sodium and water reabsorption, and it's also going to decrease potassium reabsorption. This is going to help to regulate sodium and potassium levels in the body. We have a whole pathway that's going to be involved with this aldosterone. It's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. And this is going to be what's responsible for controlling the secretion of aldosterone. So, taking a look at that. All right, I know this pathway looks like a lot, but it's really not that bad in real life. I also have a YouTube video that you can also find on this page that walks you through the RAA pathway. So if you still have questions after you hear the lecture part, go check that video out. So for starters, stimuli that initiates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone, or the RAA pathway, is going to include several things, including dehydration, sodium deficiency, as well as massive blood loss, like from a hemorrhage. All right, so these conditions are going to therefore then cause a decrease in blood volume. All right, this decrease in blood volume is then going to cause a decrease in blood pressure. All right, makes sense. You lose a lot of blood, or you're massively dehydrated. You have a drop in blood pressure. So this lowered blood pressure then is going to stimulate various cells that are in the kidneys called juxtamedullary cells. Juxtaglomerular cells, sorry. And it's going to stimulate these juxtaglomerular cells in the kidneys to secrete the enzyme renin. All right. So the levels of renin that are in the blood are then going to increase. And renin is then going to convert angiotensinogen, which is a plasma protein that's produced by the liver, into angiotensin 1. All right, so renin is making things go from angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Right, and then the blood that's containing the blood is going to contain this elevated levels of angiotensin 1. This is going to circulate through the body. And as that blood flows through the capillaries, particularly those that are associated with the lungs, there's an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE. And this is going to convert our angiotensin 1 into the hormone, the active hormone, angiotensin 2. All right? So from there, after this ACE has converted angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, this is going to obviously lead to an increase in the blood levels of our angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is in turn going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. All right, so then the blood is going to contain an elevated level of aldosterone. This is going to circulate to the kidneys, and in the kidneys, that aldosterone is going to increase the reabsorption of sodium, which in turn is going to cause reabsorption of water via osmosis. So as a result of this, less water is going to be lost in the urine. All right. So aldosterone is also going to stimulate the kidneys to increase secretions of potassium and hydrogen hydrogen ions, potassium ions and hydrogen ions into the urine. All right. So this increased water absorption that we see in the kidneys as a result of that aldosterone there is going to result in an increase in blood volume. And as our blood volume increases, so too does our blood pressure, right? Hopefully bringing that blood pressure back to normal. Angiotensin 2 is also going to stimulate the contractions of smooth muscles that are found in the walls of the arterioles. And this is going to result in a vasoconstriction of those arterioles. And this is also going to kind of contribute to our increase in blood pressure. And is therefore going to then help raise blood pressure, bringing it back to normal. Right? So besides angiotensin 2, there's also going to be a second stimulator of aldosterone secretion. And this is going to be an increase in potassium concentration in the blood. Or sometimes it can be an increase in potassium concentration in the interstitial fluid. And this can also stimulate that aldosterone to be secreted. So then, with that same kind of token, then a decrease in blood potassium levels is going to lead to the opposite effect. So that is the RAA pathway. You should know that. Be familiar with it. Again, like I said, there's an additional kind of supplementary video that I've made on this playlist that is available if you're a little confused still. So, those were our mineralocorticoids, all right? So that's how those mineralocorticoids, are regulated. Now on to the glucocorticoids. So this is going to be things like cortisol or hydrocortisone. This is going to be the most produced cortisone of our glucocorticoids, our cortisone and our corticosterone. This is going to be regulated, of course, by a negative feedback. And these glucocorticoids are going to help do a number of different things, including protein breakdown, glucose formation, lipolysis, resistance to stress, as well as anti-inflammation and depression, or like inhibition of the immune response. So looking at the negative feedback loop that's associated with regulating our glucocorticoid secretions. So when there are low blood levels of glucocorticoids, mainly specifically cortisol, this is going to stimulate those neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus to secrete corticotropin-releasing hormones, all right, our CRH. All right, our CRH then, together with that low level of cortisol, is going to promote the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. All right, and this is going to be secreted from the anterior pituitary. All right, our ACTH then is going to flow in the blood to the adrenal cortex, where it is then going to stimulate the glucocorticoid secretion, bringing again those levels back, our glucocorticoid levels back to normal. And then to a much smaller extent, ACTH is also going to be able to stimulate the secretion of aldosterone. So let's just kind of keep that in the back of your head there. Next, we have our androgens. The major androgen that's going to be secreted by the adrenal cortex is called DHEA, also known as dihydroepiandrosterone, which is not a word I will be saying more than once. So we're going to call it DHEA from now on. So anyhow, so in males, our DHEA, after puberty hits, the major hormone, testosterone, is going to be secreted in much larger quantities than this DHEA. So it's really not going to have much of an impact on males. However, in females, DHEA and other androgens, other adrenal androgens specifically, are going to play a huge role in promoting libido, and are then going to be converted into estrogens. So in menopausal women, all female estrogens are going to be coming from adrenal androgens. So this stuff's important. So those are the four groups, the four layers, the products of the three layers, of the adrenal cortex. So then moving on to the adrenal medulla, this is going to be stimulated by sympathetic preganglionic neurons that are associated with the autonomic nervous system. And the adrenal medulla is going to consist of hormone-producing cells called chromaffin cells. And you may remember that we mentioned some of these earlier, or some of these in ANP1. But these are going to be these chromaffin cells are going to be surrounded by large blood-filled sinuses. So medullary secretions are going to be epinephrine and norepinephrine, and these are going to produce effects that are going to be similar to what we would see in a sympathetic nervous response. So they are also going to be released under stress by direct innervation from the autonomic nervous system. So just like the glucocorticoids that we see in the adrenal cortex, these hormones that are associated with the adrenal medulla are going to help the body resist any kind of stress. However, they do so over a much shorter duration than what we would see from the adrenal cortex. So here you have a cute little summary of the adrenal gland hormones for your studying delights. Next, moving forward, we have the pancreatic islets. All right, we'll talk more about the pancreas when we talk about digestion. But for the endocrine system, we need to talk specifically about the islets of the pancreas. So the pancreas is going to be located in the curve of the duodenum. That's the first little chunk of the small intestine there. And these are going to have, the pancreas itself is going to have both endocrine and exocrine gland functions. We'll talk about the exocrine gland functions when we talk about the digestive system. But for now, the pancreatic islets are the part we're going to focus on for the endocrine function. So almost all of the exocrine cells that are in the pancreas are going to be arranged in these cute little clusters. You can see them right here. These are called acini, right? So these little acini are going to produce digestive enzymes that are going to be delivered. Those digestive enzymes are going to get delivered to the digestive tract through various little ducts, all right? And then scattered among these little acini, excuse me, you can see our acini over here, we can see our pancreatic islets. That's what we're looking at in this image right here. And there you can see they're a different color, all right? So this is our clusters of endocrine tissue, right, that are kind of scattered among the acini there. You can see a couple more of them. This is a big zoomed in one, all right? So the islets, the pancreatic islets, are going to contain the secreting cells of the pancreas. So there are 4 types of cells that are going to make up these pancreatic islets, and they are going to secrete different types of hormones, 4 different hormones, right? So our alpha cells are going to secrete glucagon, our beta cells are going to secrete insulin, delta cells are going to secrete somatostatin, and F cells are going to secrete pancreatic polypeptide. So when we talk about people having diabetes, that is typically a autoimmune disease where your body is going to attack the beta cells in the pancreas because it recognizes those little beta cells as foreign. So your body is attacking those poor little beta cells and it's killing them, and so you can't produce insulin. That's where you end up with diabetes. So, looking at the functional role of these pancreatic islets. So the interaction of these 4 pancreatic hormones is going to be very complex, and it's not entirely understood. So the main takeaway message that you need to understand for our pancreatic islets and the hormones that they secrete are that glucagon is going to raise blood glucose levels and insulin is going to lower it. All right. Somatostatin is going to act in a paracrine manner, and it's going to do this to inhibit both insulin and glucagon release from neighboring alpha and beta cells. All right. It may also act as a circulating hormone that's going to help to slow the absorption of nutrients from the gastrointestinal tract. Additionally, our somatostatin can inhibit the secretion of growth hormones. Right? And then last but not least, we need to know that pancreatic polypeptide is going to inhibit somatostatin secretion. It's also going to inhibit gallbladder secretion, as well as the secretion of the digestive enzymes by the pancreas. So that is what we need to know. That's what you need to know right there about our 4 pancreatic hormones and what they do. Right? It's just that simple. So here you have a cute little table looking at just a summary of those pancreatic islet hormones. So be sure you look at that. So looking at the negative feedback loop that's responsible for regulating glucagon and insulin, right? It's going to start when low blood glucose levels, also called hypoglycemia, is going to stimulate the secretion of glucagon from those alpha cells that are in those pancreatic islets. Glucagon is going to act on hepatocytes, those cells in the liver, and this is going to increase or accelerate the conversion of glycogen into glucose. This is called gluconeogenesis. Or excuse me, it's not called that. It's called glycogenolysis. Sorry. And this is going to also promote the formation of glucose from lactic acid and certain other amino acids. This is called gluconeogenesis. So as a result, the hepatocytes are going to release glucose into the blood more rapidly, and blood glucose levels are going to rise. On the other side, on the flip side there, if blood glucose continues to rise, then high blood glucose levels, called hyperglycemia, are going to inhibit the release of glucagon. This is our negative feedback loop here. If our hyperglycemia is then going to stimulate the secretion of insulin by our beta cells of our pancreatic islets. And insulin is going to act on a variety of different cells in the body. It's going to do several things. All right, this is going to accelerate facilitated diffusion of glucose into the cell, so it's helping those cells uptake of glucose. Right, It's going to speed up the conversion of glucose into glycogen. All right. It's going to increase the uptake of amino acids by cells, and it's going to increase protein synthesis. Right? It's also going to speed the synthesis of fatty acids. It's going to slow the conversion of glycogen into glucose, and lastly, it's also going to slow the formation of glucose from lactic acid and amino acids. Right? So as a result of all of these things, this insulin acting on these various cells, this is going to cause blood glucose levels to decrease. So if blood glucose levels drop below normal, then our low blood glucose is then going to inhibit the release of insulin, which is again our negative feedback loop. And this is going to then stimulate the release of glucagon. So all of those things together, we've got two negative feedback loops that are kind of working hand in hand in concert there. So next, and last but not least, we have the ovaries and the testes. We have the gonads. That's kind of our last portion of the endocrine system that we're going to discuss, because we have an entire week and a half to talk about the reproductive system. So we're going to talk about it in an endocrine sort of sense. So the gonads are going to be organs that are responsible for producing gametes. And in men and males, these are sperms. In females, these are oocytes, also called eggs. So in addition to their reproductive functions, our gonads are also going to secrete hormones. Ovaries are going to produce two estrogens. We've got estradiol and estrone. Oh, Lord. Excuse my daughter yelling in the background. So we've got two estrogens, and the ovaries are also going to produce progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin. All right? And the testes are just going to be pretty simple, and they are going to secrete or produce, testosterone. Oops. So the ovaries, these are paired oval bodies that are going to be located in the female pelvic cavity. These are responsible for producing several different steroid hormones, like we said, including two estrogens and progesterone. All right. The female sex hormones, along with follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from that anterior pituitary, are going to be responsible for regulating the menstrual cycle, as well as maintaining pregnancy and preparing the mammary glands for lactation. They are going to promote, these hormones are going to promote the enlargement of breastises, as well as the widening of the hips at puberty. And they are also going to help to maintain the female secondary sex characteristics, so that, things that are not directly associated with reproduction, but are still characteristics of one sex or another. Ovaries are going to also produce something called inhibin, and this is a protein hormone that's going to inhibit the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone. And then during pregnancy, the ovaries and the placenta are both going to produce a peptide hormone called relaxin. And this is going to increase the flexibility of the pubic synthesis during pregnancy. And it's going to help to dilate the uterine cervix during labor and delivery. And both of these actions are going to help to kind of, in theory, help to ease baby's passage by enlarging the birth canal. This is still no walk in the park, but it does, I guess, make it easier. So, fun times. Next, we have the testes, or the testicles, right? These are the male gonads, and these are going to be oval glands that are going to lie in the scrotum. The main hormone that's produced and secreted by the testicles is going to be testosterone, and that is an androgen or a male sex hormone. So testosterone is going to have several jobs, and this is going to include stimulation of the descent of the testes before birth. That's going to happen around, I think, 26 or 27 weeks of gestation. That's when those testes are going to start to descend, and that's as a result of testosterone stimulation. Testosterone is also going to regulate the production of sperm. It's going to stimulate the development and the maintenance of male secondary sexual characteristics, things like growing a beard or deepening of the male voice. All of those are secondary sexual characteristics. The testes are also going to produce inhibin, which again is going to inhibit the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone. And just a fun fact there, statistically speaking, the average human being has about one testicle. So, if you're missing one, don't worry. So here we have a summary of the various hormones They're associated with the gonads, the ovaries, and the testes. And then the last thing that we have to talk about for the endocrine system is the pineal gland and the thymus. The pineal gland is going to be attached to the roof of the third ventricle of the brain and is going to secrete melatonin. This is great when it comes to helping regulate your body's biological clock. A lot of people swear by it when it's time to take a nap or go to sleep. Taking some melatonin, they swear it helps them sleep. And this is why. This is because, in theory, if you take these pills, this should maybe increase your levels of melatonin. And melatonin is responsible for regulating your body's biological clock. The thymus, then, is going to be located in behind the sternum, between the lungs, and is going to produce thymosin, which is as well as thymic humoral factor, thymic factor, and thymopoietin. And these are going to be hormones that are going to promote the maturation of the immune system's T cells, which we will talk about when we talk about the immune system a little bit. We're not going to get too much into that. But the thymus is important for the development of the immune system, specifically those T cells. These T cells are a type of white blood cell that are going to be responsible for destroying any kind of microbes or foreign substances. So that is all we have for the endocrine system. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, as always, please feel free to contact me, or ask after class, etc. So see you next time.